Her daughter had one instruction: burn them, not archive them, not carry them 3 blocks to the New York Public Library where anyone could have read them, not donate them to a university, not even keep a single page. One instruction, 4 syllables, and it was done. What was in those papers? 6 books of poetry, 30 years of letters, notes she had written in her own hand on the envelopes of the 218 letters her famous husband had sent her, because she knew those letters were dangerous. And she had written context around them, documentation, her own voice pressed into the margins, explaining what was actually happening in the house when those words arrived. Gone. All of it. The woman who wrote them was named Blanche Oelrichs. She had been born in a 30-room mansion. She was called the most beautiful woman in America by a man who had spent his career painting queens. She published her first book of poetry at 25. She broadcast her voice across New York with a full orchestra behind her. She was married, for 8 years, to the most celebrated actor in the country, and when she died, the one person who could have saved her words gave one instruction: burn them. No ceremony. No last reading. The chair at the table where she used to sit was empty after that. The phone beside it had gone quiet. No one came to claim the story she had spent her whole life trying to tell. This is that story. And it has taken decades to find what remains of it. Subscribed to Old Money Widows, they kept her silent long enough. She was born on the 1st of October 1890, inside Rosecliff. Not just near Rosecliff, inside it. Inside her uncle Herman Oelrichs' Newport, Rhode Island mansion, designed by the architect Stanford White, modelled on the Grand Trianon at Versailles. Built at a cost of $2.5 million. The ballroom alone, 40 feet wide, 80 feet long, was the largest private room in all of Newport. When the lights were on, inside it, people on the water could see the glow. This was the world Blanche arrived in. The Oelrichs family maintained a primary residence in Manhattan and spent their summers in Newport amidst the Astors, the Vanderbilts, and the Havermeyers. Her father, Charles May Oelrichs, held a seat on the New York Stock Exchange. Her mother was Austrian, connected to old European money. Her sister Lily would go on to marry a German duke. Her niece would one day marry bandleader Eddie Duchin. This was simply the texture of their lives, introductions to people whose names appeared in history books, summers in ballrooms that glowed like lanterns over the water. By the time Blanche was a young woman, Newport society had its verdict. She was its reigning debutante. The French portrait artist Paul Helieu, a man who had painted countesses, looked at her and declared she was the most beautiful woman in America. She was not content to be beautiful. She was expelled from 2 schools. She finished her education with private tutors, under the polite fiction that she had a mischievous temperament. What that phrase means, translated from the language of 1905 into plain English, is that she could not be made to stop thinking, and that the women of her class were not supposed to think. Not openly, not loudly, not on paper. On the 26th of January 1910, she married Leonard Moorhead Thomas. He was a Yale man, the son of a prominent Philadelphia banker, a diplomat who would later earn France's Croix de Guerre for his service in World War I. He was, by every measure, exactly what the world wanted her to want. She was 20 years old. She wore the dress. She bore 2 sons, Leonard Jr. in 1911, Robin in 1915. She travelled with her husband through Rome and Madrid. She sat at the right tables in the right rooms. She was received as Leonard Thomas's wife, beautiful, well-spoken, appropriately present in city after city, for nearly a decade. She watched the suffragette movement from across an ocean and felt something tighten in her. In 1913, in England, she saw police dragging women through the street. Women who had asked, peacefully, for the right to vote, who had marched with signs and been answered with batons and arrests. She came home from England looking at her own life differently. Then, in 1914, something else happened. Something that no one around her expected. Blanche Oelrichs picked up a pen and began writing poems. Not gentle parlour verse, not the kind of tasteful rhymes that ladies of her class were expected to produce for charity albums and friends' birthdays. Something rawer, something that sounded, to the ears of 1,914, almost dangerous. Poems about longing and the body and the interior life of a woman who was beginning to understand that she had been living inside a performance rather than a life. She chose a pen name, Michael Strange. It was masculine by design. She needed the distance, a mask between her Newport reputation and what she was actually feeling, because what she was writing was not what Blanche Oelrichs, debutante, diplomat's wife, mother of two, was supposed to feel at all. In 1916, her first collection, Miscellaneous Poems, was published under that name. She would never publish under any other name again. She wore men's shirts and ties. She carried a walking stick. She moved through the artistic world of New York and Paris with a fedora on her head and a self she had invented entire, from scratch, because the self she had been assigned was not one she could breathe in. She called herself Michael Strange. She meant it. By 1918, she had written a stage adaptation of Tolstoy's The Living Corpse for Broadway. It ran successfully. Its lead actor was a man named John Barrymore, who was at that point already one of the most celebrated performers in America. She found him electrifying. She described his walk as slanted, oblique, as if his clothes irked his skin. She could not stop thinking about him. Her marriage to Leonard Thomas ended in 1919. She was 29 years old, published, alive, in a way she had not been for a decade, her world full of the noise of possibility. She did not yet understand what that fullness was about to cost her. John Barrymore was not merely famous. He was the kind of famous that belongs to a different era entirely, where a face is recognized in every city, in every newspaper, without explanation, by every person in the country. In 1920, during the Barrymore name's peak years, his fame was comparable to Babe Ruth and Charles Lindbergh. He was the matinee idol, the stage genius, the man about to play Hamlet to standing ovations from New York to London. His brother Lionel, his sister Ethel, together the Barrymores were not simply famous, they were American theatre itself, walking and breathing. He was also charming in the way that certain damaged men are charming, the way that looks, from outside, like passion and brilliance, and is, from inside, something that has learned to use passion and brilliance as instruments. He had struggled with alcohol since the age of 14. His father had drunk. The Barrymore inheritance ran in two directions simultaneously, toward genius and toward ruin. And John ran both tracks at the same speed for as long as his body would let him. But in 1917, when Blanche first saw him, none of the ruin was visible. He was still the man he would one day destroy. He began writing letters immediately. He wrote constantly, 218 letters in 8 years. Long letters, illustrated with his own drawings, signed with pet names. He called her Treacle. He called her Fig. He called her Dringle. He addressed himself in the third person as her father, and called her his mother. He wrote their love as if it were a play he was performing in, narrating each scene with the care of a man who understood that words, shaped correctly, could make a person feel like the only one in any room. It was seductive. It was strange. And in retrospect, it is precisely what it sounds like. A man who could not be fully present even in his most intimate moments, who related to everything, including the woman he loved, as material. They had been introduced in 1917 by actress Kathleen Nesbitt. While Leonard Thomas was in Europe serving in the war, Barrymore was already married. Blanche was still married. They conducted a 4-year affair. When she divorced Thomas in 1919, she was already carrying Barrymore's child. They married on the 5th of August 1920 at the Ritz-Carlton in New York City. On the 3rd of March 1921, their daughter was born, Diana Blanche Barrymore Blythe. Dark hair, dark eyes. In the early months of the marriage, it looked like something They acquired a home in White Plains, Westchester County. Blanche wrote a play for John Clare de Lune, adapted from Victor Hugo's The Man Who Laughs. He recruited his sister Ethel to perform in it, even though Ethel was not fond of Blanche. When critics dismissed the work, John wrote rebuttal after rebuttal to the newspapers, defending her in print, which looks like love, and perhaps was, in the beginning, in the way that certain men love, which is possessively, totally, in a way that requires your complete surrender disguised as devotion, because almost immediately after the marriage, the jealousy arrived. He was obsessed. The archival record states plainly, with the possibility of her infidelity. The word used is obsessed. He was extremely jealous, and possessive language that exists in the formal cataloguing notes of the New York Public Library. Drawn from the letters themselves and from the notes Blanche wrote on his envelopes, contextualizing them. She was writing. She was corresponding with critics and literary figures. She had an admirer whose name appears only as Terence in the archival record, a man who wrote to her and whose last name no one ever recorded. Because Barrymore destroyed the context around those letters. She had a life that was hers. To John, everything she did that was hers was evidence of betrayal. He did not lock the door. He did not forbid her from working or traveling. He made certain that when she came home, she felt watched. That is how it works, with certain men, not with chains, with the look on their face when you walk in. A month after Diana's birth, in April 1921, John signed legal documents giving permanent guardianship of his daughter to Blanche. He said himself that fatherhood was not a skill that would come easily to him. He refused to hold the infant. He was afraid he would hurt her. His brother Lionel came to the house and sat on the floor and played with the baby. John stayed at a distance. This was the child he would later claim was the great love of his life. He could not hold her. Remember that detail. It will matter later. The years of the marriage were years of staged distance. John performed Hamlet in New York in the winter of 1922 to standing ovations that continued for months. Then brought the production to London in 1925 to similar reception. He was paid $8,000 a week by producer Arthur Hopkins to continue the run. $8,000 a week. When he moved to Hollywood Films, Warner Brothers would pay him $76,250 per picture. Blanche, meanwhile, spent long stretches in Paris, among the lost generation writers, the expatriate artists, the people who had fled the confines of American respectability to think more freely. She wrote. She continued publishing. She kept corresponding with people whose company challenged her, and she remained, formally, John Barrymore's wife. After the 1925 London Hamlet, Barrymore came to Paris to find her. Records from the Wikipedia biography of John Barrymore document what happened. The reunion was not a happy one. The couple argued frequently. When he returned to America, she stayed in Paris, and they drew up a formal separation agreement, a document signed by both of them that provided Blanche with $18,000 a year. The same document stated that neither of them could sue the other for divorce on the grounds of adultery. Read that again. $18,000 a year, while he earned $76,250 per film, and a legal guarantee that whatever either of them did, the other could not use it as grounds for divorce. He had made it so that she could not leave cleanly, and so that he could not be held accountable. Something had been happening to the edges of her world during all of this, quietly, without announcement. Her sons from the first marriage, Leonard Jr. and Robin, moved through those years at a distance, already sent to schools, already maintained at the margins. Her first husband's social world had closed behind her when she divorced him. The Newport circle that had crowned her they had drawn back, as social circles do around women whose choices become complicated. She had written plays for John, published poetry with his illustrations alongside her words, joined the Lucy Stone League in 1921, one of the first members, fighting for women's right to keep their own names while privately losing her name to his with every year that passed. In October 1924, she was sued for plagiarism by playwright Sophie Treadwell, who claimed Blanche's play The Dark Crown had been stolen from her own work. The charge is in the NYPL archival record. The full resolution of it is not. History holds the accusation and drops the verdict. Her literary reputation was now a question. His remained a statement. There is a moment not in any letter, not in any archival note that must have come sometime in those middle years. A moment when she reached for the telephone to call someone who was entirely hers, someone outside his orbit, and paused and thought, "Who is left?" She put the telephone down. She did not try again. No one noticed. That was the point. John Barrymore did not take things loudly. This is the detail that history keeps missing. His story has always been told as tragedy, the brilliant man consumed by his own excess. And that is true, but the story of what his excess consumed around him, the women, the children, the people close enough to be damaged by the blast, that story has been told in much smaller rooms, by much quieter voices, and mostly to people already paying attention. Her literary identity, absorbed into his shadow. Blanche Oelrichs had been building serious work before she met John Barrymore. Her poems had been printed in the New York Sunday, her Tolstoy adaptation ran successfully on Broadway before she was his wife. She published her second collection, Poems, in 1919, a full year before the marriage. But Claire de Lune, the play she wrote for him in 1921, was dismissed by critics. And John's response, defending her in newspaper letters, using his celebrity to vouch for her craft, meant that her reputation now travelled through his name to reach the public. She had published before she knew him, and she needed him to explain her to the world. Resurrecting Life appeared in 1921, with his illustrations printed beside her words. A reviewer at Poetry magazine praised her emotional intensity, then used the word derivative. For a woman who had been publishing since 1916, she was also accused of plagiarism by Sophie Treadwell. That same year, the lawsuit filed in October 1924. The outcome unrecorded. A charge without a verdict is its own kind of punishment. It lingers without resolution. It becomes part of the story. Her name became a question. His name remained a fact. Their daughter, made unreachable twice over. Diana was 4 when the marriage formally ended. The separation simply became the condition of her life. Blanche raised her. She sent Diana to school in Paris, then New York, then to boarding school. By the time Diana was 14, she had not seen her father in years. In 1934, John came for one of his rare visits. He took 13-year-old Diana to dinner with an older schoolmate of hers, a 17-year-old girl. He drank heavily at dinner. According to Diana's own documented account, he hit on her teenage companion. Diana wrote about that night. She never forgot it. And what does a girl do with that? She carries it. She carries the father who gave her his name, and almost nothing else. She carries the mother whose face had closed, over years of marriage, into something that looked from the outside like indifference. She carries the gap between who her parents were to the world famous, brilliant, celebrated, and what they had available for her. She spent her life looking for her father in the wrong men. 3 marriages, each worse. Alcohol, pills, attempted suicide, a $150,000 advance from a best-selling memoir, gone within months. Around 1,939 or 1,940 records suggest. Though the exact date is disputed, John asked Diana if she could legally declare herself an adult so he could stop paying her child support. His own daughter, the child he could not hold. He asked her to free him from the obligation of her existence. The financial settlement, one-sided by design. When Blanche finally separated from John in 1925, the formal separation with the $18,000 annual payment, he was earning $76,000, $250 per film at Warner Brothers. He was paid $8,000 per week to continue Hamlet, $150,000 in a single payment for one film in 1927, $18,000 a year. While he built a 5-5-room Hollywood estate, 16 different buildings on a single property, with gardens, swimming pools, a skeet range, fountains, and a totem pole. She was provisioned. She was not provided for. When she obtained the formal divorce in 1928, she went to Europe to do it, and filed under the name Mrs. John Blythe. Not her own name, because even in leaving the marriage she could not use her own name without complications. There was no dramatic settlement record. What is recorded is the aftermath. She rebuilt without the Oelrichs' fortune fully behind her. The Newport world that had been hers by birth had not held the door open for a woman who had twice divorced and twice been the subject of newspaper scandal. She built a new life. But she built it on a narrower foundation than the one she had started from. The pattern, he repeated, immediately. John remarried in November 1928, 3 months after the final divorce from Blanche. He married Dolores Costello, an actress 22 years his junior, whom he had met on a film set in 1926 while he was still legally married to Blanche. Dolores divorced him in 1935, primarily, records note, because of his excessive drinking. His fourth wife, Elaine Barry, he married in November 1936. She was 19. He was 54. The pattern is not complicated. He needed women young enough or dazzled enough not to see what they were walking into. By the time they understood, the damage was done. By 1937, John Barrymore filed for bankruptcy protection. His documented debts were $160,000. The man who had earned $76,250 per picture, who had been paid $150,000 for a single film in 1927, who had been given a studio suite, all meals, and a chauffeured limousine as part of his contracts. That man filed for bankruptcy. He had spent it. He had drunk it. He had built 5-5-room estates and paid sanatorium bills that ran $800 a day and married 4 wives and destroyed each of those lives with varying degrees of efficiency. By 1938, he was using cue cards during film shoots because his memory had deteriorated to the point that he could not remember his lines. On some scenes, records show, he required 25 takes or more. Directors who respected what he had been would instruct their crews to address him as Mr. Barrymore, as a mark of respect for a man who was barely present anymore. He died on the 29th of May, 1942. Cirrhosis of the liver, pneumonia, hemorrhaging ulcers. He was 60 years old. His mind had gone before his body. Of his 4 ex-wives, only the last one attended his funeral. Blanche was not there. She had been gone from his orbit for 17 years by then, but she had never fully escaped his shadow, and neither, it turned out, had Diana. Blanche Oelrichs was not silent. "This is the cruelest part of what happened to her," she wrote. She published. She lectured. She broadcast. She gave her own autobiography its own title, Who Tells Me True, and put it out into the world. In 1940, when she was 50 years old, with her own name on the cover and her own account of her own life inside. Read that title again slowly. Who Tells Me True? That is not the title of a woman who accepted silence. That is the title of a woman standing at the front of a room and asking, who in here will finally tell the truth about my life? Who will look at what actually happened and say so? After 30 years of being primarily understood as someone's wife, someone's difficult ex, someone's complicated past, she sat down and wrote a book whose title is a direct challenge. Kirkus Reviews called it very good reading, then noted, matter-of-factly, that the Barrymore episode would be the best sales approach. There it was again. The episode, the husband, the framework through which everything she did was understood, reviewed, and sold. She gave lecture tours under the management of Elizabeth Marbury beginning in 1928. She stood on stages and spoke about literature, not about John Barrymore. She performed Strindberg and Wilde and Sophocles and Rostand. She appeared on Broadway in 1,926 inches, a double bill of Maeterlinck and O'Neill, playing Eleonora. In December 1927, she took the physically and vocally demanding lead role, the Duke of Reichstadt, Napoleon's son, in a revival of Rostand's L'Aiglon, directed by David Belasco at the Cosmopolitan Theatre on Broadway. And she built an audience on WOR radio in New York that grew large enough to eventually require a full orchestra accompanying her poetry readings. New Yorkers tuned in on a regular schedule to hear her voice. She was heard. She was genuinely admired. By any reasonable measure, she had built a real public life. But she could not escape what the public had decided she was. Michael Strange was understood, in every review and every profile, as Mrs. John Barrymore in disguise. The masculine pen name she had invented to protect her society reputation from her erotic verse, the armour she had chosen in 1916, 6 years before she even married him, had been absorbed into the story of his life. She had joined the Lucy Stone League specifically to fight for women's right to keep their own names, and she had still, in every newspaper that covered her, lost her name to his. She tried to document the marriage directly. She wrote about the jealousy. She wrote around the edges of what the obsession and the drinking and the anger had cost her. The archivists who later catalogued his letters to her used the language available, intense bouts of passion and anger, extremely jealous and possessive. That language came from Blanche's own annotations on his envelopes, her testimony, written in the margins of his correspondence, because it was the only form her testimony could take. She kept every letter. She wrote context onto every envelope. She appointed Margaret Wise Brown as her literary executor, the woman who had been her partner since 1940, who lived with her at 10 Gracie Square from 1943, who was 20 years younger, and understood, in the way that writers do, that documents survive when people don't. Brown died in France in November 1952. She was 42 years old. Sudden and final, the papers passed to Brown's sister Roberta, who held them for 2 years. Uncertain, before writing to the one person still alive who might know what to do, Diana's answer came back. Burn them. She had been trying to speak since 1914. For 36 years the world had been listening with half an ear and understanding her through his name, and then the rest was put into a fire. Diana Barrymore was 30 years old when she gave that instruction. She was in the rubble of everything. Her mother had died in November 1950. Her half-brother Robin had died in 1944, 29 years old. The effects of alcohol and drugs, the same current that had been running through this family underground since before any of them were born. Her Hollywood career was finished. Her first 2 marriages had been disasters. She had already swallowed 30 sleeping pills and had her stomach pumped. She was drinking steadily. She was a woman who had grown up in the silence her parents built. Between them, the silence of a marriage that produced enormous noise in public and closed rooms in private, and she had absorbed it so completely that she could not see, or perhaps did not want to see, what she was ordering when she told Roberta to light the match. Her own words about her mother are what survive. She wrote them in her 1957 memoir, Too Much, Too Soon, written with journalist Gerald Frank. She called Blanche grand, indifferent. She said her mother had disdained her. Her documented words were, "Damn mother," for her grandness and her indifference and her disdain of me. She was not entirely wrong. Blanche was grand. Blanche was, by those later years, composed in the way that women become composed when composure is the only thing that kept them safe in a room with a certain kind of man. The softness gets pushed underground. It becomes invisible. And to a child who needed it, that invisibility looks exactly like not caring. Diana was right that something was missing. She was wrong about where it had gone. It had not been withheld. It had been buried by years of extreme jealousy, by possession, by a marriage to a man who turned the genius of his attention toward surveillance, by the habit of watchfulness that certain marriages leave in the body long after the marriage ends. Diana aimed all of it at Blanche. This is not unusual. The parent who stays collects the rage that belongs to the parent who left. Blanche stayed. She raised Diana alone. She rebuilt her life from pieces while John married 2 more women and filed for bankruptcy and read his lines off cue cards and grew legendary even in his ruin. He was celebrated for his ruin. She was judged for her composure. What was saved from the fire, what exists today, are the 218 letters John Barrymore wrote to Blanche. They are at the New York Public Library, in the Billy Rose Theatre Division, in boxes requiring the curator's permission to access. His words, his drawings, his pet names, his love letters and his jealous letters, all pressed into paper and preserved. Her words exist only in the margins of those letters, the annotations she wrote on his envelopes. Her voice surviving in the space he left her. She survived in the margins of his name while she lived. She survives in the margins of his correspondence, now that she is gone. At some point, silence becomes architecture. It holds its shape, even after the people who designed it are gone. No one came, no one called, no one asked. The chair at the table was empty. The phone had gone quiet. That is what Blanche Oelrichs was left with. Not at the end of her life, but at the end of her daughter's grief. Diana Barrymore published Too Much Too Soon in 1957. It became a bestseller. Warner Brothers made it into a film starring Dorothy Malone. Diana earned $150,000 from it. She spent it all within months. She died on the 25th of January 1960. Her maid found her. She was 38 years old. What Diana wrote was true and partial, the way all accounts written in pain are true and partial. She saw her father's absence without fully accounting for what his presence would have cost everyone around him. She saw her mother's distance without understanding that it had been built as a wall, not grown as a preference, and woven through Diana's account. In the places where she described Blanche as cold and indifferent, is a woman who had been quietly dismantled across 2 decades, who had learned to hold herself still because stillness was what kept her safe, who loved her daughter in the only language she had left after the marriage had taken the softer ones. Diana aimed her fury at the parent who stayed. The parent who left became legend. Jennifer Ann Redmond, a biographer, went back to what remained after the fire. Her book, Too Fast, Too Short, The Life of Diana Barrymore, published by the University of Mississippi Press, reconstructed what could still be found, the letters, the records, the documents. It returned care to a woman who had been mostly remembered as a cautionary tale and allowed Diana her full complexity. Researchers at the New York Public Library did the same for Blanche. The Michael Strange papers, the letters, the clippings, the ephemera, the gift cards, the notes pressed into the margins of his correspondence, are preserved. They are at 40 Lincoln Center Plaza, on the 3rd floor, in boxes. Anyone who wants to understand Blanche Oelrichs must read her there. In the margins, in the space he left her. She was born Blanche Marie Louise Oelrichs on the 1st of October 1890, inside a mansion modelled on Versailles, in Newport, Rhode Island, surrounded by Astors and Vanderbilts, and a world that had decided, before she could decide for herself, exactly who she would be. She refused that decision. She was expelled from 2 schools for thinking too loudly. She invented a new name for herself. She published poetry about longing and the body at a time when women of her class were not supposed to feel either. She adapted Tolstoy and Victor Hugo for the American stage. She marched for the vote. She fought for women's right to keep their own names. She wore men's clothes and carried a walking stick and moved through the lost generation in Paris and broadcast her voice across New York with a full orchestra and wrote an autobiography and titled it A Question. Who tells me true? And she spent 8 years married to a man who was, by documented record, extremely jealous and possessive, who drank from the age of 14, and watched her from inside a beautiful face and signed away guardianship of his infant daughter, and moved immediately to the next woman when Blanche finally got free, and who was celebrated as a genius for his entire life, while she was described, in review after review, as difficult. He married 4 times, each wife younger than the last. He filed for bankruptcy. He lost his memory. He read his lines off cue cards while crew members were instructed to address him respectfully, because he deserved that much. He died, celebrated, mourned, legendary. She died at 60 in a Boston hospital, away from the city she had built her life in, of leukemia, with her son Robin already gone and her daughter in the middle of her own destruction and the woman she loved dead 2 years hence. She was reported to have said, near the end, that John Barrymore had been the great love of her life. I have read everything that remains of what she wrote. I have read the margins of his letters, where her own voice survived the fire. I have looked at what she built, and what was taken, and what was burned. I do not believe she was speaking about him when she said it. I think she was speaking about the woman she had been in 1917, when she walked into a room and felt, for the first time in years, completely and dangerously alive. That woman, the one who wrote poems that shocked Newport, who invented her own name, who adapted Russian literature for Broadway, who wore a fedora and carried a walking stick through the streets of Paris, who put her whole hand into the question of what a woman could be when the world was not looking, that woman was the great love of Blanche Oelrichs' life. And John Barrymore spent 8 years making her smaller. Her name was Blanche Oelrichs. Say it clearly, because for a very long time, no one did.